John Gormley. Welcome to this hour of the radio program, and I thank you for checking in here wherever we find you on this day. Well, it is our regular session every month or 6 weeks or so. Premier Brad Wall comes in studio. He joins us on the phone. It is called Ask the Premier. It's our checkup on all things Saskatchewan. You may have a question to the Premier on some area of public policy, something you've been concerned about, something the government is doing or not doing, a query you have, and this is where we go to the phones. We also answer questions via text, tweet, however you want to ask your question. Premier Brad Wall actually today joins us in studio. Premier, thanks for stopping in.
Morning, John.
Let's begin. I've usually come armed with a number of questions, and listeners, it's 1-877-332-8255 if you want on with Premier Wall. Let's sort of go top in terms of top of mind and then back into some other issues. The whole issue of the speaking fees question. Justin Trudeau, formerly, before being an MP, a professional speaker, continues after an MP charging. Why did you weigh into that debate?
Because I was asked, my opinion by the media. There was a story that Global was working on, and it had a real Saskatchewan angle, the literacy conference here that he spoke at, where I think they had a $43,000 budget for speakers, and proceeds, if they had any, would go to the next year's conference. It's obviously a pretty important issue. One of our MLAs spoke at it, Rob Norris, for example, and his charge was $20,000 to the conference. So I was asked if I thought that was right. I said no. I actually don't think it's right when we're elected that we would be paid to speak on issues on national, in this case, obviously around education, but of national interest or of provincial interest. In my view, we get paid to do that already.
So Norris's fee would have been
zero. Norris gets paid. Rob Norris gets paid as an MLA by the taxpayers, and part of the job description, I would suggest, would be that he would speak out on issues when asked. He represents constituents. He gets involved in public policy decision making, as MLAs do on both sides of the House, and they also get paid to speak both in the legislature and outside of it, and I think that's true for members of Parliament. By the way, I understand that Conservative Senator Jacques Demers, I think, spoke at that same conference and charged a fee. That's also wrong. This is not a partisan statement. But I was simply asked a question and answered it. And I think, as you have pointed out on this show, and others have now too, this notion of elected people not being paid to do what they're already being paid by the taxpayers to do, for example, is not new. The United States banned the practice by a congressional initiative in 1991, and 22 states have banned this sort of thing as well. So the short answer to the question, though, is I was asked, and typically when we're asked to comment, if I have a view, I'm going to share it.
Okay, so those who follow the strategy and tactics of politics say, well, this is Premier Brad Wall placing himself on the national agenda, A, because he wants the national attention, B, because he's going to succeed Stephen Harper as leader of the Conservative Party.
Those people are reading way too much into everything. And we do that, those of us who are involved in politics. I find myself doing the same thing. I'm a political nerd. And so I read a lot of things into what other people do and say, this is somebody asking a question. It was related to a Saskatchewan conference, the literacy conference, and I answered the question. Premier
Brad Wall is here. It's Ask the Premier. Now, and I've got a ton of stuff here. Before we move off, though, Gene Mikowski, your MLA, former rider, player, football great, then hears you and refunds some fees he had collected for a couple of football-related appearances. Serge Leclerc, who'd been a motivational speaker and an author who passed away, who'd been an MLA, had Leclerc charged as well?
I don't know. We asked him to not, or if he did, to reimburse the charity or the organization that had invited him. I had asked him that personally, and my understanding was that he was doing that. I think there's a report out that confirms it. Extra-provincially, I know he spoke in the U.S. at Crime Stoppers meetings. I'm not sure what happened there in terms of remuneration or expense coverage, but as far as we know, he was doing what we had asked him to do. Now, he was still selling books and DVDs. He had both of those things. He had authored a book, and he would sell those, but that's quite different than speaking.
Is there a need, in view of this national dialogue, to have a provincial amendment to how you pay MLAs, just to make clear whether it's the Board of Internal Economy, whether I don't know how you work the regulations, but do you need a regulation that makes it clear elected MLAs do not collect for speaking?
I don't think so. I think it's pretty clear right now. Certainly that's the direction we're going as a caucus. That's pretty unequivocally known now, I think, in the province, and I understand the NDP hold the same view. So I'm not sure we need to have another rule in terms of the conflict of interest guidelines for MLAs. I wouldn't rule it out. I guess it's up to really the members of the House to decide that, and I don't think we should rule anything out. In the case of Gene, Gene did the right thing. He did hear my comments and remembered these two particular events, which were, frankly, a little bit different than what we were talking about with Mr. Trudeau, but still, in the main, the same principle at work here. And, Gene probably got called for holding a few times in his career, not very many, but a few times, and some of them would have been maybe more egregious than the others. This would fall into the latter category, but he did the right thing. And by the way, he reimbursed all the funds. He didn't ask the charities if they were if they wanted to or not. He thought this was the right thing to do, and I think on the weekend was writing checks. So he's just a class act and did the right thing, I think, in this regard.
Premier Brad Wall, one more question. Media here saying, you take some pay from your party, the Sask party. You speak at premiers and leaders' dinners. Is this at all in the same category?
Well, I would say no. I work for the party. I work for the Saskatchewan party in addition to my other duties as premier and as MLA, and so there's an administrative function there. There are other things I need to do for the party in terms of promoting, recruiting candidates, making sure we're ready for an election campaign. Part of that is speaking, raising money, at different events we have. Political parties of various stripes have in the past had an additional allowance for the leader. We did that prior to me becoming the leader of the party and in the Saskatchewan party. So it's completely different than speaking at a charity and then charging the charity over and above what I might already get paid for my duties as leader of the party, or more importantly, specifically as Premier and MLA. Premier
Brad Wallace here. Okay, as if we go back chronologically in time, earlier this week you were at the Western Premiers meeting in Manitoba, which, now is this by necessity a get-together before the full national premiers meeting? I mean, is it a bit of a warm-up?
It's happened since 1973, is the Western premiers have been meeting for that long, pretty much every year. And so I think it's turned out to be a bit of preparation for that summer meeting of all of the premiers. But we also advance issues over and above that preparation for the Council of the Federation meeting. There's a couple of points I want to make on the meeting that we had earlier this week in Winnipeg that haven't got a lot of coverage. As you will know, John, the country, Canada, has been not embroiled, but we've been in some pretty intensive discussions with our American counterparts, and I know you had Ambassador Jacobson on the show earlier on the issue of COOL, or country of origin labeling, where the Americans are now labeling beef or meat products that come from Canada in terms of the livestock that might come across the border. We see it as a non-tariff trade barrier in our country, and it's pretty important in Western Canada. We have a third of the country's beef herd here in Saskatchewan, for example, and obviously it's a concern to those in the pork business. And it has been for a while. The Americans actually lost at the World Trade Organization on this issue. We challenged them, they lost. They seem to be ignoring the ruling. So our agriculture minister nationally has quite rightly said we're going to consider options to retaliate. In other words, to look at some U.S. imports into Canada if they're not going to abide by WTO, and maybe we'll retaliate with some trade measures there. Now, this needs to be the last resort. We need to be a free trading continent. But at some point, if the binding dispute mechanism process takes too long to resolve these, or if our either trading partner ignores the World Trade Organization, as the Americans seem to be doing, we need to act. We ought not to be Boy Scouts about it. So the Western premiers agreed with the federal government, basically providing support for them to canvass the various options that are there for us to retaliate against.
If you need to take retaliatory measures.
That's right. And it should be the last option. But we need to send a signal to our American friends that when you lose fair and square at the WTO, it's time to move on. And this particular trade barrier is important to us in the West because of the livestock business. So that's point number one. Point number two that did get a little bit more coverage, a real exchanging of information on bullying, on what each province and the territories, frankly, are doing to prevent bullying, cyberbullying, and bullying in the schools as well. As you know, we have Jennifer Campo, one of our MLAs, who's been moving around the province, having consultations on this issue. We're exploring all of our options now, and it was very interesting and helpful, frankly, the discussion we had. And there are some things that BC is doing, for example, I think we're going to look very carefully at that might have have a positive impact here in the province.
What sorts of things?
Well, they have an interesting system where they empower kids to report immediately to an online source if they witness bullying, especially in the schoolyard. And so the resource officers are deployed, or in a real extreme case, 911 is called. Now, my first question to Premier Clark was, has there been a lot of mischief as a result of this? Kids maybe just jamming up other kids, for example, who may or may not have been actually bullying. And she said they've found, I think it's been about a year now, the incidence of that is relatively low. So we're going to look at that because they're pretty happy with the results, and the teachers report. I think the educational sector is reporting positive results from this process. So that's the kind of thing you can do at a premier's meeting. You can compare best practices and maybe see what might work here in the province.
Premier Brad Wallace here. This is our session of Ask the Premier for the month of June. Lines are lighting up. Callers will get your questions on. Any queries you have of the Premier you wish to make, John Gormley live at rawlco.com on email, at John Gormley live, Facebook, Twitter, or text us at 306-306. This is News Talk Radio. John Gormley, Premier Brad Wallace here. This is our monthly session of Ask the Premier. Any of your questions in play on the business of your Saskatchewan? The Premier's here now. Premier, a call coming up on the foreign ownership or purchasing of farmland. Before that, though, the number out this morning, Statistics Canada doing its population quarterly update, 1,093,880. So you're 6,000 plus away from 1.1 million.
Right.
I analogized this morning. It's like pushing a car out of a snowbank. Like 1.1 million is so close. Push.
And so what do we do in Saskatchewan, John? We keep pushing. Right?
Okay,
we keep pushing till the car's out. But think about it. I mean, 1.094 million people, not very long ago, and I'm not going to be overly partisan, but I remember the previous government saying it was statistically impossible for us to do basically population growth at the national average 1% a year, which over 10 years would get us to 1.1 million people. Well, they were right, actually. We have exceeded that. Again, and this isn't the government taking credit for it, but this should be to the credit of, obviously, the business people in this province and families and others who are welcoming newcomers to Saskatchewan at in record numbers, but we're very, very close to 1.1 million, and we're going to get to 1.1 million, and then we're going to keep moving beyond that.
In your growth agenda you laid out last fall, you're actually projecting what? You're going for 1.2?
1.2 by 2020.
Okay.
Yeah,
which is a relatively short period of time.
Well, it is.
7 years.
It is, but we have seen this real significant, robust growth activity happen in about 6 or 7 years, is when it really started to pick up. We've got every reason to believe that we could keep growing, John, because the same fundamentals that got us to this point from an economic standpoint are in play. In a world where the fastest growing economies, the fastest growing middle class populations want food security and energy security, in that world, I like our chances because that's what we're in the business of, both food security and energy security. And so I know that's a gross oversimplification, but those are the fundamentals and they're in our favor. And so we should be hopeful about the future.
As far as the population, a lot of our numbers have been international immigration. I mean, we've had the highest rates of international immigration in a century. So what does it look like inter-provincially between the provinces?
We're attracting people from every single province. During this time of rapid growth, that's been true of every province in the country, where we were seeing more people come into Saskatchewan than leave for other provinces. It's true today as well with these numbers, with the exception of Alberta, who are, of course, heating up economically as well. And so we're back to competing with Alberta. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but we had a slight number more moved to Alberta than moved from other provinces here. And so, that's something, when you're next to Walmart, you got to compete with Walmart. Alberta's been strong for a very long time. They're starting to pick up again. And we're going to continue to compete with them. By the way, that's why we say we have to look at things like the corporate income tax so we can bring it down to be in line to be competitive with that province. There are other things we can do, other areas where we are arguably even more competitive. Though housing costs have gone up in Saskatchewan, I think you can make the case we're still more affordable than the growth centers in Alberta. But we have to be aware of that issue as well. And if we don't take this growth for granted, if we're vigilant about the fundamentals of growth as a province and looking after this wonderful new paradigm as we should be, we're going to continue to compete with Alberta. But more importantly, we're going to continue to grow our population, and that's something that we weren't saying not very many years ago.
Premier Brad Wallace here. This is Ask the Premier. Let's go to our first caller, Travis in Carnduff, Saskatchewan. Travis, you're on with the Premier on farmland.
Hi, Mr. Premier. I'm just wondering about foreign ownership on land and stuff like that. I live in the extreme southeast. We've had people out of Alberta and the States come in, and they're buying all the farmland, driving up prices, and there's numerous young farmers out here trying to get established. And they're coming in paying 3 times what land has previously been going for, and none of us young farmers are even getting a chance at this land. Just wondering if there's any rules, regulations on this for foreign investors?
There are, Travis. We haven't changed them, but there are pretty stringent rules in place in Saskatchewan in terms of the foreign ownership of land. And again, they haven't been changed by our government, but we're hearing a bit of this from other places. And what we encourage you to do, Travis, is contact the Farmland Security Board, because we do have investigators in place. Those investigators are there to determine if this is happening in violation of the rules that we have in Saskatchewan.
But there are there not differences in the rules between a Canadian and necessarily somebody living from outside the country?
Sure, there's differences between residents of the country and non-residents, or foreign, those from other countries who are wanting to purchase farmland.
Premier Brad Wallace here, 1-877-332-8255. This is Ask the Premier. Other issues that I was sort of going down on the list of things, the House rising back at the end of May, the new Employment Act in Saskatchewan, which was finally passed this time. When does that take effect in terms of actually being, it's been approved now, been passed? When does it get proclaimed?
Well, it's going to be proclaimed here very quickly. It can happen in pieces, as you know. There are some parts of that we're going to move forward with immediately. We're going to index the minimum wage, for example. As you know, we tried to modernize some of the labor legislation in the province that we hasn't touched through other pieces of legislation. And we're pretty hopeful that this too is part of our growth plan. We need to be fair to both employers and employees, but to be competitive in terms of our labor legislative environment with other jurisdictions. We had moved on essential services. We'd moved on freedom of information in the workplace. We've moved on secret ballot certification. We've revamped the construction labor relations in the province through Bill 80. And John, on each of those occasions, the opposition, some of the union leaders predicted terrible things would happen to labor peace in the province. It wasn't true then. And I think you're going to see that repeat itself with this current piece of legislation that will be now proclaimed.
Premier Brad Wallace here. We'll get caught up on some other changes to Saskatchewan legislation and back to your calls. This is News Talk Radio. I'm John Gormley, and yes, I do personally, and I'm not making this up, I hand-pick the sound bridges for this show.
Yeah, that's keep your hands to yourself, the Georgia Satellites, is it not?
Very good, thank you.
It's a good pick.
You can play that.
I could play it on my iPad.
Oh.
I think it has more than the 3 chords that I'm proficient in.
Okay.
I think it might have that 4th chord that throws me.
Premier Brad Wall here. We're taking your calls. Okay, some great calls coming up and questions. And lest I sound too light, but this is the time and place to do it. You appear, even on the newly reconstituted Green Zone, which is just fabulous radio. You're still doing Premier's Picks this year.
I am.
And that's Wednesdays?
Notwithstanding the fact that the News Talk Radio hosts clearly cheat, I'm back. I've signed up for another year.
Excellent. Premier's Picks. Okay, because one of our callers...
That means you, Gary.
Guy just said, I would love to hear the Premier's predictions for the upcoming Rider season.
Really?
Want to go at 18?
We are going to have a great party in November, and it's because we're hosting the Grey Cup, but it's because we are hosting the Grey Cup.
So the Riders are going to be in the Grey Cup?
Absolutely.
Outstanding. You heard it here first. I'm John Gormley, Premier Brad Wall. Questions, answers, anything on your mind. Okay, let's go to caller Andrew has a great question on health. Andrew, you're on with the Premier, and your question is about physicians.
Good morning, Premier Wall. I'm wondering what the province is doing about recruiting pediatric neurologists. We're currently without one.
Well, this is a huge issue, and the province is working with the health regions on this particular recruitment initiative. There's reports that the health region here in Saskatoon has extended an offer to a new pediatric neurologist. And so nothing further than that, except that's pretty hopeful. We're also working with the existing two pediatric neurologists so we can deal with some of the issues around retention, which is very important.
Because one left and the other's on leave.
Right. Yeah. This is a shortage in our province. It's a shortage. It's a pan-Canadian issue. It's a shortage in healthcare systems across the country. So the offer we hope is accepted. That would be a start. And I could tell you we're going to continue on doctor recruitment as we have for the last 5 years. There are now actually, this is not about specialties perhaps, but we have now more doctors practicing in Saskatchewan than we did by just over 200 or so than we did about 5 years ago. We have locum pools now in place that are relieving places like Arcola, places like Kindersley, Maidstone that have had real challenges in keeping facilities open and providing services. We came in the last legislative session with a new incentive for doctors to graduate and then practice in rural Saskatchewan by reimbursing them a significant amount of money to go towards their student loans, or really for whatever they would like it to go towards. So we see some progress, but clearly not enough, especially in the area of specialties, as has been raised by Andrew here on this call.
Premier Brad Wallace here. Let's get back to the calls. Kathy in Prince Albert, you have a question on rental and accommodation. Kathy,
yes,
Premier.
My rent's going up from $675 to $725 in December. Now, rent keeps on going up because the cost of living is going up. Now, I think they should have rent control because there's so many people are homeless that can't afford to pay that extra rent, and I think we have to do something to increase more benefits for the rent increases, for rental supplement, and because the rents keep on going up and up and up.
Kathy, good question. Premier Wall, in that kind of scenario, what are you dealing with?
Thanks, Kathy. There's a number of programs we've offered to folks who need the help and increased, especially for those who are at perhaps their lower income families in the province, and then some who are facing the challenge of disability. So we've seen a significant increase by our government, something called SED, the Saskatchewan Assured Income for the Disabled program that we initiated. Even in this last budget, another $50 per single, $60 per couple who are living together to help with their household expenses. We have increased the rental supplements as well through social services, and in fact, in certain housing regions or social services regions, we're indexing it to inflation so that it notionally should be able to keep up. It's still a challenge. I am not saying that it is not a challenge for Kathy and others that face this. I can tell you, though, that we've looked carefully at rent control, as did the NDP when they were in government. They rejected it then. We're rejecting it now because it doesn't work, because we see actually rent control having a real dampening effect on the construction of new apartments. In Saskatchewan today, we're breaking building permit records in terms of multifamily residential construction. Some of it's condos. Some of it is rental. We have a new rental corporate income tax-based rental construction incentive that we passed in a budget not this last year, but the year before. We're seeing some uptake there. So the market's responding. It's slow, and because of the rapid growth in the province, it's slow. And so the issues are there, and we're working to try to deal with those who are most vulnerable with targeted programming such as those I've mentioned.
Premier Brad Wallace here. This is Ask the Premier. Your calls, 1-877-332-8255. Get a hold of us on Twitter, Facebook, or text at 306-306. Any of your queries answered. Other changes recently, the motorcycle issue in SGI, which has been the subject of a great deal of discussion, a committee struck that has been working with SGI, rates capped, I know, but now this move on the discussion of telematics, where SGI is trying to do a pilot project to assess the way in which some motorcycles are driven. How do you weigh in on the government-owned insurance company using telematics?
It's voluntary, John. It is a real-time virtual technology, so that the insurer, in this case SGI, and the rider can monitor driving habits and how that impacts risk, and the risk, of course, then informs premiums, either going up or maybe coming down or staying flat. And so there is a new technology that allows for this that other insurers are doing. Yes, private insurers are doing these kinds of things. We simply want to make this a tool available to not just SGI but riders, but on a volunteer basis. And I've seen some of the Twitter action around it, some of the comments, and the people worried about sort of Big Brother now watching people as they ride. That we're not. That's not what this is about. This is completely voluntary. And by the way, it won't be anything but voluntary, even if we see it pay real dividends both to riders and the insurance system going forward.
So that challenge on motorcycle insurance of making up inside the auto fund, which was a pretty serious, about a $9 million shortfall, how do you ultimately bridge that gap?
Well, I think there's a number of ways that we can do it. I think the committee that you've referenced is going to look at a number of options, including perhaps allowing riders to opt out certain components of the insurance that is the most costly, that drives costs within the auto fund. There is the other option of just gradual increases rather than the rate shock that we provided for riders here just a few months ago and have now adjusted. So there's a number of options, and they're going to look at all of them so that we can keep the auto fund whole. We don't want one class to be subsidizing another class. That's not fair to the other motorists. But neither is a rate shock so great that people just simply can't afford to ride anymore. So we've got to find the balance. I think there's some tools and some innovations we can look at, and we've told that committee to canvass all of those options. Premier
Brad Wallace here. We'll get back to your calls. More questions on Ask the Premier. I'm John Gormley, only on News Talk Radio. John Gormley, Premier Brad Wallace here. This is our monthly session of Ask the Premier. Back to your calls. Mike in Swift Current, you're on with the Premier on environmental regulation.
Hi, Premier Wall. I'm just wondering, I've heard there's new legislation on noxious odor control from the oil field standard. And I was just wondering if you might clarify what the new regulations are.
Now, this is on clean air laws?
Clean air as far as noxious odors like H2S and that type of stuff would go. Pertaining, I guess, mainly to farmers, that type of thing.
Thanks, Mike. This is likely part of some changes that we're making in the environmental area of government, known as the Environmental Code, moving towards more of a code than the kind of legislation we've typically had in the province. And so I can endeavor to get back to Mike with the details.
Okay, let's take that on a follow-up.
That's a very specific question. I can get to him with the specific information.
Okay, Mike, next Premier's appearance, we will have an answer on the environmental regulations on particularly oil field related odors, that kind of thing. Speaking of follow-ups, I didn't push you. You did bring a follow from the last session where there was a question from
Marlene in Moose Jaw. She asked if the government was considering traffic lights at the intersection of Highway 1 and 9th Avenue North. I know that intersection well. I travel that highway often between Swift Current and Regina. It is a challenging intersection. Engineering studies have been done on the intersection, and the studies have concluded that the traffic lights are not advisable at this time. We're listening to our engineers in this regard. Their concern is that traffic lights at high-speed intersections, when people are traveling, obviously at a high rate of speed on the number one highway, can increase the number of rear-end accidents, for example. And so, since 2008, there have been numerous other safety initiatives, safety features installed on the highway, an exit ramp from Highway 1 eastbound, widening 9th Avenue North, for example, to provide a northbound to eastbound turning lane, realigning Highway 1 westbound entrance, and upgrading signage. But we're going to monitor it. Obviously, this is an issue. I've heard the mayor speak about it in Moose Jaw, and so we're going to continue to look at this particular intersection. Right now, though, we're taking the counsel of highways engineers who are saying that intersection with lights may not be the best solution for what is a pretty challenging intersection.
Premier Brad Wallace here. Let's go to Rob in Saskatoon. Rob, a question on oil.
Yeah, good day, Premier Wall. Just a quick question. With all the oil boom in Saskatchewan, I was wondering if there's any plans to attract a second refinery, possibly around the Kindersley area.
We have indicated to the industry, the oil industry, that we're very open to this kind of a project. In fact, we've said to some who might be proponents for it that, we're not ever going to invest taxpayers' money into these kinds of projects as we've seen in the past. In other words, government picking winners and losers. Governments typically only get that half right. We will, though, look at new growth tax incentives. We'll look at other ways that we can make this work. I also have had a discussion with Premier Redford where we've in turn asked our energy ministers to start talking about what might be possible with adding more value to the oil here. So that's very much on our agenda, and we're working to not just solicit interest, but when we hear a little bit of interest, we are trying to be aggressive in pursuing it. Another important development in this regard, not necessarily a refinery or an upgrader, though, is the west-east pipeline that's being talked about, the reversal of a Trans-Canada pipeline that would take Saskatchewan oil, Alberta oil, to the east coast where it can be refined. Yes, we'd like to add the value here, but we'd also like to get our oil to Tidewater where we can get a better price for Saskatchewan people. Right now, Saskatchewan people sell their oil because it's theirs, not the government's or not the companies. They sell their oil at a roughly 13 to 19% discount, partly because of grade, but partly because we get West Texas prices instead of Brent prices. And then even off West Texas, there's another discount because of pipeline capacity issues. And so to our treasury, we're losing, we could be losing up to $300 million a year in tax revenue, with which we could reduce taxes, pay down debt, build some highways. And so this is an important issue to the province. Refine it here, yes, but also get more of our oil to Tidewater where we can get a better price for Saskatchewan people.
Okay, we'll get back to the calls. Quickly, though, we talked to the ambassador earlier this morning, David Jacobson, friend of yours, guy who's now leaving back to go to Washington, or at least back to Chicago. I'm not getting a real good feeling on Keystone XL. He's not saying anything, but there's all this talk about ups and downs and pluses and minuses and, buffering decisions. How are you feeling about Keystone XL?
We were there in March. I felt good about it then. We had great meetings with both Democrats and Republicans and State Department officials as well. Felt pretty good about our chances because the State Department, by the way, has now weighed in twice on Keystone. Both times they've been fairly benign reports, not pointing to any particular concerns, kind of green-lighting the project on a de facto basis anyway. And I don't think the administration would necessarily want to see those kinds of benign reports go forward if they really thought they were stopping it. Now, there might be some sort of attendant action by the Obama administration to give himself some environmental room with certain interest groups. Maybe they'll go after coal a little harder. Our regulations against coal in Canada are more aggressive than theirs. So maybe he does that, and then that gives him the leeway with his environmental interest groups to approve Keystone. I'm still hopeful, though. I just worry that the timing is getting pushed further and further off, and we need to get a better value for our oil in Canada now, not later.
Time for one more call quickly. Let's go to Terry in Cadillac, Saskatchewan. Terry, you're on with Premier Brad Wall.
Hey, guys. Mr. Premier, I'm on RM Council down at Val Marie, and a resident from the village approached me on the weekend. They're in what the government-owned low-cost rental units, and she said that they're planning, you guys are planning on selling the houses, and her rent is going to go up just about triple from $575 to just under $500 or $1,500. And when she asked, well, why are you doing this? And they said, because we want to sell them. So if you don't like the rent, you can buy it. Well, they can't afford it.
And that's in Val Marie, Terry?
Yeah, right down even farther south than me, John.
Okay, yeah, I've been there. Okay, any...
Well, I think they're looking at some changes with respect to the amount of the kinds of homes that the government owns through Sask Housing that they make available for social housing. For example, we own a lot of single family units when we should be owning multifamily units to add increase capacity. But Terry, I'll get back to you through the show next month with the details on what might be happening in Val Marie.
Outstanding. So the July edition, when you're back, we'll pick up that Val Marie question and then the other one on oil field clean air.
Right.
Those issues.
We'll do that.
Premier, thank you as always. Appreciate you being here.
John, thanks for the time.